Good morning. I am live and it is Wednesday, the 2nd of August 2023, and I'm reading Out of Time, Out of Mind. It is an autobiography by Joan Marshall Grant. She describes her ability to far see, and it starts from her childhood, and we are now in the third part. Chapter 7 was very interesting because she had a dream, a vision of a soldier who drowned, and she saw him and communicated with him and then went back into her body. So that was very interesting. We are now at chapter 8. We're in the 1920s, and she is over 20. She had her 21st birthday, so she's grown up. Chapter 8. Enter Gillian, I think. Early in July, we decided to spend a month in Bavaria to strengthen us for another dose of Scotland. And the day before we left, I discovered I had started a baby. I was so delighted that it was difficult not to tell Leslie immediately. But in case he wanted to cancel the trip, I decided to keep the electrifying news to myself until I was safely abroad. Unlike me, Leslie preferred to reach his destination as quickly as possible rather than to journey hopefully. He obtained, as usual, a route from the RAC, the most direct and not the most picturesque one, and we followed this through the northern France, lurching over bumps and jolting through villages on broken pavé. I had not been there before, except in dreams during the war, and I found the rusty barbed wire, the broken trees, the shell craters that still pitted the fields, far more depressing than I had expected. Would there be another war in which my child would be killed? Father and H.G. Wells were sure there would be a much worse one. Were they right? And if so, was I idiotic to be so pleased that I was having a baby? When we paused for a hasty sandwich, lunch en route was considered a waste of time. An old man came out of a hut built in the ruins of a farm and insisted on showing us a trench where French soldiers had died standing to. A shell had buried them alive, but their rusty bayonets were still sticking out of the ground. Instead of adding to my depression, I found this oddly consoling. It was brave to be killed, but braver still to make new bodies for the dead to live in. A little further on, we passed a field where shell craters had been filled in, and young vines were beginning to sprout from the ravaged earth. Men were stronger and brave and could destroy, but women's patience was stronger. They planned new vines and waited a lifetime for another vintage. I think that was the first time Joan was ever proud of being a woman. We intended to press on to Freudenstadt in the Black Forest, but when we reached Strasbourg, I prevailed on him to stop the night there by telling him about the baby. He was so pleased that I immediately revived, and we set off to look for a restaurant in which to celebrate. We were sitting at the table when we discovered that both thought the other had got marks from the bank before we started. Tomorrow we could cash our letter of credit, but we only had 7 shillings now between us. None of us could understand the German menu, so we read down the price columns until we came to a dish that was within our range, hoping that vegetables would be included. Unfortunately, we had both ordered mayonnaise. Luckily bread was free. Dipped in mayonnaise is not as usual meal, but we pretended to enjoy it. And I think the waiter never realized that we were as startled by our choice as he was. We spent 3 long weeks in a village on the Starnberger See, the lake in which Ludwig of Bavaria drowned himself. I felt perfectly well, but developed an embarrassing habit of fainting. Leslie refused to let me drive the car, so as he spent every day sailing, I never saw the castles I wanted to see, nor did I hear music in Munich. When not sailing, he played chess in the Weinstube, where women were not encouraged. I bore it as long as I could, and then decided to go home by train, leaving him to follow by car when he felt inclined. He drove me to Munich station, and the train was due to arrive in a few minutes when I fainted again on the platform. Leslie propped me up on a seat, told me not to move until he got back, and dashed out of the station. He came back, bundled me into the train, and jumped in after me. "But the car," I said anxiously as the train drew out, and I realized he was traveling with me. I gave the document to a man standing by the bookstall, told him my wife was ill, and asked him to get it to England. He seemed very confident. Everyone told us we would never see the car again. They were quite wrong. It turned up in London 3 weeks later. Even a packet of cigarettes was still in the glove compartment on the dashboard. We had a very warm letter from the kindly stranger saying how flattered he had been by Leslie's instant recognition of his honesty. He was the proprietor of a small hotel in Monte Carlo, and so I supposed he was hardened to eccentric foreigners who had left things behind and expected them to be forwarded. I had shown that I could manage without a cook, and now intended to prove I could look after my own baby. This produced such a storm of protest, not only from mother, but from my contemporaries, that I had to abandon the idea. Apparently, it would be insane to think I could do without a trained nanny, as it would be to suggest removing one's own appendix. A.D. felt so strongly about it that he told Mr. Blundell to buy a house for us, a house with 2 nurseries and a spare room where Malcolm could live, except when A.D. and Babs wanted a room in London. So in the following March, we moved into 22 Ilchester Place, one of a new row of houses built in the grounds of Ilchester House, and within convenient pram ride of Kensington Gardens. A benign providence allowed every woman to feel that, in spite of all evidence to the contrary, her first pregnancy is unique. I did not even have any interesting symptoms, and I shared with countless millions, although the sentiment was not fashionable at the time, the conviction that having someone I dearly loved inside me was the most enchanting state to be in. It was the only time in my life that never for a moment have I been lonely. That's lovely. From the time I started the baby until a month or 2 after she was born, I was too far absorbed in what I was doing to have the wish or the energy to dream. If anyone, especially mother, dared to suggest that I was in any way an invalid, I became fiercely defensive. It was a nuisance that I had to have a maternity nurse, but so that she would not interfere, I parked her in a hotel and only summoned her at the very last minute. I was, however, unpleasantly surprised to find the actual process of birth so painful. It would have been much less so had I not thought it necessary to carry on a conversation to show that I was not subjugated by pain. Friends came in relays, and when they left exhausted, I babbled to others on the telephone. The nurse became increasingly sour. Dear Feathers, the Featherstone Dr. Featherstone sat on my bed with Leslie and chatted. At 2 p.m, I refused an offer of twilight sleep. Hours passed. Leslie, you had better go now, said Feathers. Don't be such a damn fool, said Leslie. Gillian at last was born in the late evening of the 2nd of April, 1930. 20 minutes later, I telephoned to Mother to tell her she had another granddaughter. She was horrified at my being allowed to telephone, and would have been even more dismayed if she could have seen Gillian being repeatedly told by Leslie that she was an exceedingly beautiful baby, while she peered at us from the open neck of his shirt. At the time I thought it was quite hideous, but would have died rather than admit it. She was quite hideous. Yes, 3 days later, when Kirsten looked at her and said, "Goodness, aren't newborn babies ugly?" I was so furious that I told her to get out of the room before I threw something at her. And when she had gone, I burst into tears and ran quite a high temperature. A month later, A.D. followed up his telegram of congratulations with a letter which told us that we had a house, a baby, and Leslie was now in chambers in the Middle Temple. We could stand on our own feet, so he was cutting off our allowance. The only thing to do was to sell the house, but this took us a year, during which we lived on credit, and my overdraft as England had just gone off the gold standard, and our private road bristled with for sale notices. Malcolm shared the siege with us and wrote a very erudite book on philosophy, A New Argument for God and Survival, which was published by Faber's in the following autumn. Leslie had recently met 2 men called Wyeth and Neil, a healer and a seer, whom at first I liked nearly as much as he did, although Malcolm took a violent dislike to them and on sight. We took them down to Seacourt for a weekend, and Neil discovered for himself the ghost in the music room. It had been a monk who left the monastery at Bosham in the time of King Canute to become a hermit on Hayling Island. Solitude cannot have suited him, for he was still pacing up and down a path, now covered by the music room and the side gallery of the tennis court, muttering, "I am greater than Augustine." Wyeth must have dealt with him effectively, for none of us was troubled any more. Wyeth gave 5 or 6 lectures at Ilchester Place, and he lectured once a month at several other houses in London. Leslie never missed one if he could help it, but first I became bored because the lectures were always the same, and then actively disliked going to them because he was using a small amount of quite genuine experience to create a dogma which became increasingly nonsensical and didactic. But I had not yet realized how much Wyeth hated me. Gillian was a year old, and Malcolm had married before we had last found a purchaser for the house. After paying our bills, there was so little money left that I went with Gillian and Drakey, her nurse, to whom she and I were both devoted, to live in the cottage at Seacourt, while Leslie lived at his club and came down for weekends. Except for 3 months, when again we were in our rooms in Half Moon Street, so that we could help Margot nurse Duncan while he was dying of a throat infection. I stayed at Hayling Island for nearly 2 years. It was not a satisfactory arrangement, and I at last discovered that I could afford to live in London again by borrowing on reversion under my grandfather's will. Work for a young barrister was so scarce that it was becoming increasingly obvious that Leslie could not expect to get enough at the bar even to pay the rent of his chambers. So I tried, not very successfully, to earn money. I worked for 6 months with an architect, drawing up plans for converting slum streets in Chelsea into bijou residences. When the plan had been passed, the backer for whom we were working, share of future profits but no salary, suddenly went bankrupt. I then scrapped up enough to buy a quarter share in the Golden Cockerel Press and learned a certain amount about the art of producing private editions, but a great deal more about packing parcels. This lasted for 18 months and at times was amusing, if not financially rewarding. Owen Rutter, one of the other partners, tried to encourage me to write a book. I worked feverishly at it for several weeks, and then, when I heard Leslie's candid criticism of the manuscript and reread it myself, I had to agree that it showed no vestige of literary talent, so I abandoned the effort. He was even more convinced than I was myself that under no circumstances should I ever become an author. Chapter 9. Recorder. Soon after we were both back in London, I met Hilary Durham Matthews at a luncheon party, and we found each other so congenial that we went home together and talked until long after dinner. A few days later, she asked Leslie and me to drive down to King's Beeches, her mother's house near Sunningdale, where she wanted to collect some flowers. It was raining when we got there, and her mother was out, so there was nothing better to do. She showed us around the house. The last room we went into was very different to the others. The furniture looked as though it had come from a suburban vicarage, and the walls were smothered in very amateur watercolours, except where these gave place to photographs of clerics in glossy pitch-pine frames. Incongruous in such surroundings was a sword, in an emerald green velvet scabbard, decorated with gold filigree, hanging over the mantelpiece. Hilary said rather apologetically, "Everything in here belongs to my stepfather. Mother only married him last year, and neither Jack nor I can understand why she landed us with the dreariest kind of vicar." Did the sword come from the vicarage too? Yes, improbable though it seems, it belonged to Nelson's Captain Hardy, who was an ancestor of the vicar's. Leslie took the sword from the wall and, obeying a sudden impulse, handed it to me. Tried to find out whether Nelson said "kiss me" or "kismet." I think kismet is far more likely, as he often used the word. I would if I could psychometrize, but I can't. You could try, said Leslie. Oh, do, Joan, said Hilary. So feeling foolish as a conjurer who knows there's no rabbit in his hat, I sat down on the sofa, shut my eyes, and pressed the hilt of the sword against my forehead. I made my mind blank and expected it to stay like that. To my surprise, visual images appeared as though I were seeing them through a third eye, set between and slightly above my eyebrows. I described what I was seeing. The sword belonged to a man called George Augustus Murray. He was short, fat, had curly reddish hair round a bald patch, and a very high forehead. He died near Chichester. He had been a naval captain. He had lived He had 2 liver and white spaniels, and his wife, a dumpy little woman, usually wore a mob cap and a large cameo brooch. I put the sword down. There, I told you, I couldn't do it. I know Hardy was very tall and had black hair. I suppose the bit about the fat little man is something I dreamt and only just remembered. They were disappointed, for unlike me, they had expected something interesting to happen. We heard a car coming up the drive and hastily put back the sword and left the room, in case the vicar was annoyed at us going into his study. At tea, Hilary asked us how Hardy's sword had come into his possession. It did not belong to Hardy, but to another of Nelson's captains, said the vicar. He was an ancestor of mine, George Augustus Murray. As an excuse for our interest in the character, of whom none of us had heard until the last hour, Leslie pretended to be doing research for a friend who was writing a biography of Nelson. The vicar swallowed the bait together with yet another cucumber sandwich, and was clearly flattered that his forebear was going to be rescued from obscurity and put into a book. He had 2 small portraits in his bedroom of Captain and Mrs. Murray, which fitted my description even to the mob cap and the cameo brooch. And next day, after looking through some family papers, the vicar rang up Hilary to say that Nelson's biographer might be interested to know that Captain Murray died at Fittleworth in Sussex. Fittleworth is near Chichester, but there was no evidence that he had ever had spaniels, only a reference in a letter to my faithful dogs which accompany me everywhere on my walks abroad. The only other possession of Captain Murray's was a gold medal, which Hilary borrowed, luckily, without the vicar noticing its absence, so that I could do it in the following weekend at a home near Windsor. That was much more fruitful than the sword. I still have the notes she jotted down while I was talking. They are rather disjointed, for I was speaking faster than she could write, and she did not know shorthand. It reads like a commentary on a football match. Much flatter than the original, for it lacks the emotion which was present in my voice. Our ship is flying white flags with scarlet crosses. Boys are running, carrying hot shot and powder. Sailors are now naked to the waist, a great cracking on a canvas. Will the wind freshen? Our ship won't come about, and the enemy is sailing down on us with a following wind. He fires a broadside, misses. Shall I fire? No, wait. Get the ship round and bring steer chaser guns into action. Their foremast is broken below the cross tree. They're hacking the foremast with axes. We've hit them amidship. A shot has torn away our mainsail. Buckets of water are being sloshed over our deck. Sweating men are reloading the guns. Big ropes round the guns to check the recoil. We fire another broadside. Only 5 of their guns answer. They drift down astern, heeling to larboard. Shipton is hit. Both his legs have gone. The deck is slippery with blood. Tell the powder monkeys to swill it down. They sprinkle sand from the red canvas bucket on the deck. The other ship is drifting. She runs out, a white flag on the forepeak. Cheering from our ship. I go up on the poop, give the order to lie to, and send a boat to accept their surrender. Their captain is Don Filippo de Rodriguez. He bows and hands me his sword. I take him to my cabin and offer him wine. There is a splinter cut over his right eye. I take a white linen handkerchief and bind his forehead. Under his wig, his hair is grey and cropped close to the skull. I must go and see the men. 17 have been killed or gravely wounded. I must not let them know that the sound of sawing and the smell of blood and boiling tar makes me wish to vomit. I bend down and put my hand on the shoulder of a dying man. His scalp is hanging loose and one of his legs has been severed above the knee. They are all wonderfully cheerful. I tell them of our victory. A friend of Hilary's who was listening asked, "Did you notice the colour of the smoke when the guns were fired?" White as steam. Sure? Quite interesting. Interesting? Interesting. Gunpowder of that period produced a white smoke, but it hasn't been made for over 100 years. Psychometry became our favourite game for several months, but as it usually gave me a headache, I was not as keen as was my audience. It was hard work, which none of them realized. But when they could produce something like it to contain an interesting story, I was usually willing to oblige. Soon I refused to give anything likely to contain information that the owner would have preferred me not to know. It was their fault for using me as a guinea pig, but it made me feel as though I had been spying on them through a keyhole. For instance, John Bowen gave me his signet ring to do, because he thought it might have interesting scenes of the Zulu War during which it had been worn by his grandfather. But what I saw was Joan crawling through the mud of no man's land and diving for cover into a shell hole. He was shuddering from the noise of the barrage when another man slid into the same shell hole. He was in German uniform. John was just going to shoot him and praying that his revolver hadn't jammed when a very light went up and the German said, "John, don't be such a bloody fool." The German offered the Englishman a cigarette from a gold cigarette case. It was inscribed in a facsimile of John's handwriting, a 21st birthday present which Joan had given him when they were at Oxford together. As dawn was breaking, they crawled back to their opposing wire. John was so elated that he told his major what had happened, adding that it was a damn silly war when you met your best friend and nearly shot him in the no man's land. "You realize, I hope, that you could be court-martialed for fraternizing with the enemy," said the major coldly. "However, I will forget what you have told me, provided you promise to keep your silly mouth shut." John had kept his promise until he handed me his signet ring. There were other things I saw which were far more embarrassing to me than these things which forced me to dissemble and say I had seen nothing, which was seldom believed. So I turned from objects which might unwittingly contain dangerous knowledge to the impersonal field of experiment offered by the British Museum. In these expeditions, Hilary was a most faithful and competent scribe. Notices demanding "do not touch" had to be ignored, and a wary eye kept open for keepers, not to mention more conventional visitors. That we got results at all, I think, is a tribute to our persistence. Here is one of them. The museum's description was "winged figure and winged human head bull from a doorway in the palace of Sargon, king of Assyria, 721 BC. Mine was more elaborate. This was beside a doorway of a palace at the head of a flight of colossal stone steps. From the foot of the steps stretches an avenue of crouching winged bulls, with a double row of palm trees behind them. Up the avenue, a procession of returning warriors approaches. Between their ranks are prisoners who are being lashed with thonged whips, the thongs being tipped with metal. Prisoners who fall down are kicked or goaded. The goads are about 18 inches long. There are bullocks carts loaded with treasure. Some of the prisoners are roped to the wheels of the carts. The ropes are so short that they have to bend and then stretch up their arms as the wheels turn. A woman falls and the cart goes over her chest and crushes it. On one of the carts, lashed upright by grass ropes, is a golden cow with a jeweled necklace. It is the size of a calf and has been captured from the temple of the prisoners. They looked up to it in despair. It is their god, and their hope is gone, because they cannot understand why it does not strike down their captors. I'm seeing this through the eyes of a soldier who is standing beside this statue at the head of the steps. The scene is very brutal, but I am unmoved, as to him it is commonplace. Now the prisoners are wailing, "Hathor, the mighty, Hathor, the omnipotent, ruler of the water, ruler of land," to the gold cow which is now at the foot of the steps. The king comes forth from the palace and carrying a litter with 12 bearers. The litter is covered with gold beautifully scrolled and has dark red cushions. On each side of it there stand 2 fan bearers. The king's crown is high and cylindrical, gold, with rows of square jewels or enamel. He has black hair and his beard is elaborately curled. His tunic is red and white with an embroidered pattern like a necklace's. He wears rings and armlets and his legs are thonged with jewels. His toenails are dyed red and so are his fingernails, which are very long. When the crowd sees him, they all bow down. The prisoners begin wailing again, "Hathor, the mighty, Hathor, the magnificent, we are as the sand beneath thy feet." Now the king is giving judgment. The women are to be divided among the soldiers. If the men will not look with reverence upon their conqueror's gods, their eyes shall be put out. If they will not pray to their conqueror's gods, their tongues shall be torn out. If they will not listen to praise of their conqueror's gods, red-hot rods shall be driven into their ears to make them deaf. This sentence was being put into effect when we were interrupted by a conducted party, and I was glad of an excuse not to have to see any more. Well, that was a particularly interesting chapter, and we are now, the next one is the chapter 4. I hope you have a very good Wednesday.